Clifton Powell, the final verdict that changes everything to shockwave. Has Hollywood just lost Clifton Powell? Breaking news out of Hollywood has stunned fans and industry insiders alike. Reports have confirmed that Clifton Powell's sentence is final, and the announcement has left many wondering if one of the most recognizable faces in film is now facing the definitive end of his career. The news spread quickly across entertainment circles, sending shockwaves through a community that had watched this man work tirelessly for decades to build something remarkable from almost nothing. For those who have followed his journey, from the gritty streets of Southeast Washington, D.C., to the glittering lights of Hollywood, the weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Clifton Powell is a name you may not immediately recognize, but his face is unforgettable. For more than 3 decades, he appeared in film after film, building a reputation as one of Hollywood's most reliable and versatile character actors. His breakthrough came in 1993 with Menace to Society, a raw and unflinching urban drama that captured the harsh realities of street life with uncompromising honesty. Powell's role in that film earned him immediate attention for his electric energy and rare ability to bring genuine authenticity to the screen. There was something about the way he inhabited a character, the weight he carried in his eyes, the coiled tension in his body, that made audiences sit up and take notice. He was not just playing a role, he was living it. Soon after, he became a familiar and beloved presence in the Friday film series, where his sharp comedic timing and natural charisma made him an instant fan favorite. Powell had a range that few actors in his position could match, moving seamlessly from hard-edged dramatic roles to light-hearted comedic performances without ever losing the thread of authenticity that defined his work. He proved repeatedly that he could inhabit almost any character he was given and make it feel real. Directors loved working with him. Audiences loved watching him. And casting agents knew that whenever production needed someone who could command a scene without overshadowing the story, Clifton Powell was the man to call. By 2004, Powell had cemented his reputation in a way that few character actors ever achieved when he appeared in the critically acclaimed biopic Ray, starring Jamie Foxx in the title role. His performance as Jeff Brown, the loyal and steadfast road manager of the legendary Ray Charles, was nuanced, measured, and deeply human. It earned him a nomination for an NAACP Image Award, placing him in the spotlight alongside some of Hollywood's most respected names. Over the years, he accumulated credits in films such as Dead Presidents, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, Rush Hour, and Next Friday, each time leaving an impression that audiences carried with him long after credits had rolled. By the time his career had fully matured, Powell had amassed more than 100 credits across film and television, making him the man Hollywood called when they needed someone unforgettable, whether the role demanded a menacing villain, a warm father figure, a cunning street hustler, or even a hard-nosed cop. What made Powell truly unique was not simply the volume of work he produced, but the remarkable versatility he displayed across every genre and style he touched. He had the rare ability to terrify audiences with a single menacing glare, to deliver a punchline with perfect comedic timing, and anchor a dramatic scene with quiet emotional depth that lingered in the mind. This extraordinary versatility earned him the deep respect of directors, casting agents, and audiences across generations, building a career that most working actors could only dream of achieving. Yet for all of the professional success, Powell's personal journey was far from smooth, and the news of his so-called final sentence now forces us to examine both the remarkable triumphs and the painful troubles that have defined his life in Hollywood. How could a man who worked so hard to climb from the depths of poverty and obscurity to genuine recognition, who survived the brutal streets of Southeast Washington, D.C., and transformed his difficult life into a genuine Hollywood success story, now find himself at the center of a breaking news bulletin that sounds disturbingly like the end of the road? The contrast between his rise and what followed has rarely been so stark. On one hand, Powell was the actor who seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing in blockbuster films and cult classics alike, never far from the cultural conversation. On the other hand, his off-screen struggles and controversies were quietly mounting, creating a parallel story that was far less glamorous than the red carpets and flashing cameras suggested. The case that nearly ended everything. Newly resurfaced details confirm that Clifton Powell's long-running legal battle, which first began more than a decade ago, has now been fully and finally settled, with no criminal charges upheld against him. For years, The story was whispered about in industry circles, but only now is a complete picture finally clear. A man once celebrated for his commanding presence across more than 100 films and television projects found himself brought to his knees by a series of allegations that would follow him through years of courtrooms, tabloid headlines, and professional fallout. But the most disturbing part of this entire saga is how much devastating damage had already been done long before any court made any final decision. How does an allegation, one with no proven foundation, nearly destroy the career of a man who fought so hard to build his life from scratch? And more importantly, what does this reveal about the extraordinary power of public opinion in the entertainment world? The ordeal began in the late summer of 2011, when a woman using the pseudonym Kiani Myers came forward with shocking accusations against Powell. According to her claims, an encounter in a hotel room in New Orleans had crossed a line, beginning as consensual before becoming, in her words, too aggressive to continue. She alleged that when she asked him to stop, he ignored her request entirely and carried on regardless. Myers, who at the time worked as a cocktail waitress at Harrah's Casino in New Orleans, filed a complaint that quickly spread to the press with alarming speed. Outlets such as TMZ picked it up immediately, reporting on the incident in blunt, unforgiving headlines that left little room for nuanced context or the fundamental presumption of innocence. For Powell, the sudden shift in public perception was nothing short of devastating. Overnight, the actor who had made audiences laugh on Friday and moved them to quiet reflection in Ray was being painted in an entirely different and damaging light. His name now linked to one of the most serious allegations any man can face. From the very beginning, Powell denied the claims unequivocally and with absolute conviction. Through his representative, he issued a statement declaring that the accusations were entirely false and that he intended to pursue every possible legal remedy available to him against the woman who had made them. Yet, once such allegations enter the public sphere, the damage begins almost immediately, and it does not wait for the truth to catch up. Even though the original criminal investigation was ultimately dismissed for lack of sufficient evidence, the headlines did not vanish. They lingered, they spread, and they attached themselves to his name in ways that would prove extraordinarily difficult to shake. Myers later pursued a civil case against Powell, seeking financial damages in excess of $75,000. This meant that even without a criminal conviction or any finding of guilt, Powell would remain entangled in a prolonged legal fight that threatened to drag on for years, forcing him to defend not just his freedom, but the very reputation he had spent decades building. The civil case became the consuming center of Powell's life during this period, taking up enormous amounts of time, money, and emotional energy that should have been directed toward his work and his family. Unlike criminal court, where the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, civil cases operate on what lawyers refer to as a preponderance of evidence, meaning the question becomes not whether guilt is proven to near certainty, but simply whether it is more likely than not that the accusation is true. For celebrities especially, this creates a uniquely dangerous environment. The mere suggestion of wrongdoing can be enough to permanently taint careers, regardless of what the courts eventually decide. Powell understood this clearly. He later told interviewers that the worst part of the entire ordeal was not the legal process itself, but the erosion of trust it caused, the steady loss of professional opportunities, and the devastating realization that many people had already made up their minds about him long before any evidence had been properly examined. Hollywood is not known for its patience or its loyalty when scandal erupts. The entertainment industry, worth billions of dollars, relies heavily on reputation and public image, and studios are quick to distance themselves from any actor whose name becomes associated with controversy. For Powell, the impact was immediate and severe. Roles he had already secured began to vanish. Producers grew hesitant and fearful, unwilling to risk negative press coverage. Television appearances that would once have been his without question were suddenly canceled after only a handful of episodes. Powell himself recalled one particular show where he had fully expected to appear in 7 or 8 episodes, only to find his part quietly disappear after the second, with no explanation offered beyond the dark cloud of allegations hanging over his name. The emotional toll proved even heavier than the financial losses. Powell described this period as the most painful experience of his life since the death of his father decades earlier, a comparison that says everything about how deeply the situation cut him. He explained that as a father himself, the accusations wounded him in ways that went far beyond professional disappointment, not only because of what they implied about his character, but because of how his own children might come to view him in the wake of such devastating headlines. He maintained his innocence throughout every step of the process, but he could not shield his family from the whispers, the rumors, and the creeping doubts that seemed to follow them wherever they went. When he walked down the street, he saw suspicion in the eyes of strangers. Online, anonymous voices painted him as guilty before any court had even considered the evidence. In a business where public perception often carries far more weight than documented facts, Powell had already been effectively sentenced by the court of opinion long before any judge had spoken. The civil case wound its slow and painful way through the legal system. For 4 long years, Powell lived under its shadow, struggling to maintain both a career and his personal life, while lawyers and judges debated the details. In 2017, the case was finally thrown out, with insufficient evidence found to support the claims. By 2018, his own counterclaims for defamation and emotional distress were also dismissed, leaving the entire matter legally closed. Yet even in this technical victory, Powell found himself grappling with a strange and bitter reality. While the court had cleared him, Hollywood had not fully followed suit. This is a hard Powell's tragedy, and it is precisely what the phrase final sentence takes on its deepest and most painful meaning. He was never found guilty of any crime. No court ever determined that the accusations against him were true, and yet the sentence he carried, the one imposed not by a judge but by public perception, by industry fear, and by the relentless machinery of tabloid media, proved far more lasting than any courtroom verdict. In an industry where perception can be more powerful than truth, the accusations themselves became the punishment. A dismissed case should have freed him completely. Instead, it left a scar that would not easily fade. Colorism, discrimination, and Hollywood politics. Clifton Powell's career was shaped not only by the personal troubles that dragged him into courtrooms and tabloid headlines, but also by the deeply systemic barriers that have existed in Hollywood for generations. Powell has spoken openly and with striking honesty about the ways in which casting decisions were frequently influenced not by his talent or his professionalism, but by the shade of his skin. He recalled specific situations where producers or network executives dismissed him outright, saying that he was too dark for the role, or, in one particularly painful and humiliating instance, that he was so dark he might scare viewers. Hearing these kinds of rejections repeatedly, after years of proven work, after nominations and critical acclaim, left Powell questioning whether his years of training and his established track record even mattered when the first thing people seemed to notice about him was his complexion. Hollywood has long operated on the troubling principle that marketability is tied to relatability, and that relatability is often judged by how closely an actor conforms to Eurocentric beauty standards. In practical terms, this meant that darker-skinned actors were frequently excluded from leading roles, particularly in romance-driven storylines or in roles that require the audience to identify with the character in a sympathetic or aspirational way. Powell's talent was undeniable, recognized by colleagues, directors, and critics alike. But these deeply embedded systemic preferences place him at a disadvantage that no amount of hard work or professional dedication could fully overcome. What made this reality even more painful was a glaring contradiction it revealed. Powell was consistently praised for his ability to play gritty, intimidating, or menacing characters with genuine conviction and depth. Yet when it came time to cast a role that demanded sensitivity, romantic charm, or emotional vulnerability, his skin tone was suddenly treated as an obstacle rather than an asset. This double standard severely limited his growth as an artist, confining him to certain narrow archetypes, while keeping him at arm's length from the kinds of opportunities that could have expanded how the public perceived him and what roles he was offered. Within the black entertainment community itself, Powell also noticed a damaging tendency to criticize one another publicly, particularly in mainstream outlets that were already quick to dismiss or minimize black artistry. In one notable instance, he found himself at odds with acclaimed director Spike Lee after Lee made remarks that Powell felt were unnecessarily harsh toward another black actor. Powell responded publicly and without hesitation, saying that he did not respect anyone, including himself, who would take their grievances to the crossover press and publicly diminish a fellow black entertainer who was simply trying to succeed in a difficult business. This stance reflected his sincere belief in solidarity and mutual support. Even in an environment where competition was fierce and genuine opportunities remained frustratingly limited, this spirit of standing firm despite formidable barriers was part of what made his NAACP Image Award nomination for Ray so deeply significant. That recognition was not simply about applause for a single performance, but about the larger validation that his work mattered, that it had genuine value beyond the narrow restrictions of Hollywood's often unconscious biases. In Ray, Powell played Jeff Brown alongside Jamie Foxx's Oscar-winning portrayal of Ray Charles, and his nuanced, grounded performance stood worthy of the company it kept. The nomination proved that his contributions could not simply be ignored or overlooked, even in an industry that too often found convenient excuses to do exactly that. Personal struggles, temptations, and loss. Clifton Powell's rise in Hollywood is most often remembered through the lens of the unforgettable characters he brought to life on screen. But the man behind those performances was shaped by a childhood that forced him to grow up far faster than most. Born and raised in southeast Washington, D.C., Powell came of age in one of the most challenging neighborhoods in the city, a place where crime, poverty, and profound lack of opportunity defined the daily reality for many young men. When he was only 4 years old, his mother passed away, leaving him in the care of a father who struggled with alcoholism and could not provide the stability that a young child so desperately needs. Powell often described those early years as a constant and exhausting fight to stay out of trouble, surrounded by friends and peers who were frequently pulled into dangerous paths that led to prison cells or early graves. For him, survival meant leaning heavily on whatever mentors and family members were willing to step in and keep him from being swallowed whole by the streets. Although he eventually escaped that childhood through sheer determination and discipline, the wounds of loss and deep instability followed him into adulthood in ways that were not always immediately visible. Like many who grow up in disruptive family environments, Powell sought comfort and stability in building a home of his own. He married Kimberly Powell, and together they built what appeared on the surface to be a stable and loving family life. But Hollywood's relentless demands, the constant travel, the long and irregular hours on set, the distractions and temptations that come with rising fame, placed his marriage under strains that eventually proved impossible to overcome. The relationship collapsed, leaving him devastated on multiple levels. The divorce cost him not just emotionally but financially, with Powell himself admitting that he lost $5 million in the process. For a man who had worked for decades to achieve real financial security and provide for his children, the blow was enormous and disorienting, stripping him of savings he had carefully accumulated and forcing him to rebuild at a stage of life when most of his peers were beginning to think about stability and retirement. Powell has spoken candidly and with genuine remorse about the mistakes he made during this difficult period, acknowledging that his single-minded devotion to work and the powerful temptations of fame left him absent from his children's lives far more than he should have been. He admitted openly that he was not there for his children the way a father should be, a confession that reveals both deep regret and hard-won self-awareness. He explained that while he had provided for his family financially, his physical absence and emotional distance left a gap that no amount of money or material gifts could ever truly fill. He reflected honestly that being away from home 50% of the time might have been manageable, but being absent 70% of the time was simply too much. This awareness came too late to prevent the breakdown of his marriage and a lasting strain on his relationships with his children, but it speaks volumes about the true emotional cost of a life lived in relentless pursuit of success under Hollywood's unforgiving spotlight. Alongside these personal struggles, Powell also fell victim to familiar temptations that have ensnared many who find themselves suddenly living the entertainment industry lifestyle. He admitted to gambling heavily and frequently, often losing between $30,000 and $50,000 a year at casinos. What might seem like manageable indulgences for a wealthy celebrity added up quickly and relentlessly, draining his finances at precisely the moment when they could least afford to be drained. Powell also acknowledged the presence of what he called fake friends, people who surrounded him not because of who he genuinely was, but because of what he could provide them. The lifestyle of constant spending, fleeting relationships, and shallow friendships built on status and access created a growing sense of imbalance and vulnerability. He later described this period as a spiral, a slow-motion descent in which decisions that felt exciting or liberating in the moment only deepened his problems and complications in the long run. The duality of Powell's life became increasingly stark and difficult to sustain during these years. Outwardly, he remained a successful working actor, appearing in films and television shows that reached audiences around the world. Fans saw him on screen as powerful, confident, and larger than life. Inwardly, however, he was a man struggling to hold his family together, wrestling with devastating financial losses, and slowly drowning in the mounting consequences of his own decisions and circumstances. The carefully maintained facade of success concealed a personal reality that was fragile, unstable, and quietly unraveling. This widening gap between the public perception of who he was and the private reality of what he was living through left him uniquely and tragically exposed when the accusations of 2011 finally emerged, bringing everything to a head in the most public and painful way imaginable. The story of Clifton Powell is ultimately a story about far more than one man's career. It is a story about the ruthless mechanics of fame, the vulnerability that lies beneath success, the systemic barriers that define who gets to succeed and on what terms, and the terrible swiftness with which public opinion can dismantle what took a lifetime to build. The final verdict may be in, but the full truth of what this man endured and survived is only now beginning.